De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 40, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, whitewashing settler colonialism, attempts to preserve the quote-unquote United States of America. We're going to be talking about the rewriting of history of settler colonialism in the United States. And also, we're going to take a look at some quote-unquote pro-American propaganda in mainstream media. We're going to discuss how this type of propaganda attempts to rewrite the bloody history of white supremacy, the importance of supporting national liberation movements and struggles in the United States, African liberation, indigenous liberation, Chicano liberation, and why any sort of semblance of U.S. quote-unquote American identity, the flag, the history, that has no place on the left, on the real revolutionary socialist left. And joining me today is my good comrade, Erica Caines, who is a poet, writer, and organizer in Baltimore and the DMV area. She is an organizing committee member of the anti-war coalition Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member of the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with books that represent them and books that tell the real history of the United States of slavery and genocide, not the melting pot nonsense that we get from mainstream media. How's it going, Erica?
Peace. You might hear my son in the back.
No worries.
You know,
I love when we hear from him on the podcast. By the way, shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Shout out to my boy Orlando. He said, it's interesting to see so many so-called socialists easily and correctly label a place like Israel as a settler colonial project, but cannot carry forward the same level of analysis for the USA. Indeed, comrade, I definitely 100% agree. Zionism, at its roots, was branded as labor settlerism and based on the oppression of Black, brown, colonized peoples in what is today Palestine. Shout out to Volvo. Shout out to Falcon General, Death to America. Shout out to Gustavo, que vivan los comunistas. To Stephen. And Gustavo also said Americana is fascist propaganda. Shout out to Big Teal, by the way. Peace, comrades, Erica and Ramiro. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, is the whitewashing of settler colonialism, rewriting the history, because something that me and Erica have been talking about for a while, just in general, is that within the U.S. political culture, because the liberals and the Democrats have appropriated so much of the social justice rhetoric and have pushed forward this narrative of a seat at the table and have been calling out the racist roots of the US more, I think something has created where people now assume that anytime you're pointing out racism or national oppression in the US, now you're just some liberal NGO Soros-backed person, which I think is a very incorrect analysis. And even within the left, there has been attempts to rewrite the history of the US to brand it as the American Revolution and not as a settler colonial project by racists and imperialists from the UK and from Europe in general to enslave Africans and to commit genocide against indigenous peoples. And I think it's something that is important to really discuss and talk about, especially from the perspective of national self-determination. So what I want to do first is I want to play a clip from the great Malcolm X talking about why he is not American, why he's African, and why he does not identify with this empire of the United States.
African Americans, or so-called Negro. One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. And because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. So our unwanted presence, the fact that we are unwanted, is becoming magnified in all of America's preachments today.
The brilliant Malcolm X laying down the law, talking about, quote unquote, the United States. Our forefathers are not the Pilgrims. That's why even when people talk about we, when they're like, oh, we, America, I'm like, who's we? You know, right. Even when it comes to like climate change, they're like, we. I'm like, you think if I go right now to like Trump country or to some of these 98% white areas, they'll view me as a quote unquote American. So, Comrade Erica, you know, just turning it to you, do you identify as American? Tell us why or why not.
No, I just want to shout out Nefer Freeman because Nefer is really on me. Like, that's how I sort of unlearn the we. Because you just say that like habitually, you know, by like habit. You know, you used to saying, oh, our country, even if you're talking negatively about the country, you're still used to identifying with it. So there would be times where I'd be like, yeah, our president, he'd be like, who president? Like, that's not, you know? So now I've learned to like really understand that, you know, I'm not a part of that we, I'm not a part of that our, and wasn't meant to be, right? If we understand the nature and the foundation of this nation. But no, I do not identify as American. Hood Communist has on our Hood Communist Radio, we have a good public education episode. We talk about what it means to be African, what it means to identify as African. I identify myself as an African, which is, of course, as I talk about in that podcast episode, you know, it's new, but I do identify as African because I understand it as a political identity. The same way I understand is identifying oneself as American in the same way. So I don't align with the concept of this settler colonial nation. But I do understand myself as an African. And because I understand myself as an African, I understand that if Africa is not free, then my own sovereignty and my own freedom is at risk.
Yeah, most definitely. Same with me. I mean, it's just, for me, it's like, understanding the history of the United States, understanding the true nature of colonialism changes your perspective. This is a political cartoon that I want to share with y'all. This is something, I had a great high school teacher who used to teach us about the real history of the United States. This is by a man named Puck. I forget his first name, but this is from the 1800s, late 1800s during the Spanish-American War. It's called School Begins, and it's Uncle Sam, quote unquote, teaching the subjugated colonized peoples under the domain of what is considered the area of control of the US. So you have in the front the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba. In the back, you have some of the states that are already, quote unquote, students. Texas, California, New Mexico, which are all colonized areas from indigenous and Chicano in Mexico. And then you have in the back, if you could see a Native American indigenous student with the book upside down. You have a Chinese student in the back. You have a young African man cleaning the window. And basically the whole theme of this political cartoon is teaching, quote unquote, patriotism, US patriotism, to the subjugated colonized peoples. And whenever I talk about the importance of national liberation and sovereignty and why I reject America, this idea of America, and this idea of the United States, this is how I feel. This is how some white leftists look to me when they try to tell me like, oh, that's reactionary, that's ultra left, to point out that there are oppressed nationalities, where it's like, shut up, like just embrace the empire, you're American, without understanding that these people have viewed us as lower class. Look at the way we're depicted, and mind you, this political cartoon is like one of the most famous in US history. It's a cartoon that accurately represents how the US empire views colonized and oppressed nationalities. So I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
Yeah, if you could put it back up, I just wanted to note one thing. Because when you said this is how you view like white leftists who try to hold on to like empire in that sense, or like the American dream, or that America could be something better than what it is. I'm looking at the window washer, right? It's the African, and I'm thinking about ADOS and those type of reactions that would look at this and say, well, because we were washing the windows, we deserve a piece of of this empire. And, that take that perspective as opposed to looking at it for what it is, or having a different understanding of what this is, or even understanding settler colonialism. So when I seen that window washer, it made me think of like, this is how people sort of root or plant themselves as, we built this nation, that sort of kind of rhetoric. That's what I'm thinking of, like how people sort of cement themselves to that sort of Americanism, because they had some part in building it without even really understanding the colonial aspect of it. And that's on purpose, right? We understand that too. So I know we want
to. No, definitely.
And
by the way, for people who are unfamiliar, what is ADOS? Because it's something that I think is good to kind of go over.
Yeah. What is it, like? American Descendants of Slaves, I think. And then there's like the foundational Black Americans. Like there's a lot of little sects that are popping up, and I get at the root of it. It's there's some validity to it, but it's ultimately reactionary. Just because, if not because it's tying oneself to a dying empire that subjugates them anyway.
Right. Exactly. By the way, shout out to Comrade Big Teal, Socialist Pan-Africanism for the win, indeed. And that's not to say that like all nationalism or patriotism is bad. It's just recognizing that there's a qualitative and quantitative difference between how the U.S. identifies nationalism and patriotism, the preeminent imperialist power versus the global South, Angolan nationalism, right? Zimbabwean nationalism that is rooted in the anti-colonial struggle. Shout out to my boy B-Level, just curious, Ramiro, as a Latin American guy. What do you think of the term, quote, American, applying not to the USA, but to the Americas in general? like the Bolivarian Pan-American idea? That's a great question. First of all, I think it's important to mention that the term America has usually been used to describe the Americas overall, not just the United States. Even then, I'm not somebody who's like OD big on like language policing. Like, I think it's important to use correct terms and stuff, but some people kind of go OD with that. In terms of Bolivarian Pan-Americanism, I think it's different from what people in the US or North America consider Pan-Americanism overall, because even Bolivar's last quote one of his last quotes before he died was, "The United States is destined to plague the Americas in the name of liberty." And he recognized early on Bolivar's idea of Pan-Americanism included the United States and Canada and the hemispheres overall. But as the 1800s began progressing, as we saw the rise of slavery and colonialism in the United States and the rise of imperialism at its very germ level, he began to see that there was a quantitative difference between the United States. You can't compare the United States and a country like Trinidad on the same level. They have, even though they're both American, one is obviously completely different than the other. So I don't know if you have, Comrade Eric, any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a great point, and even to like, I know we don't want to language police, but I think that it is important to identify that the reasons why we view the U.S. strictly as America without even consideration of the rest of the region or the rest of the Americas, right? That sort of hegemony that is encapsulated in us from, the way that we are taught about the U.S. So, like, I greatly appreciate that being pointed out, because we do have to catch. It's no different to me than, saying we, our, just being reminded that, even in the context of this conversation, even if we know that we're talking about the United States, it's still important to encapsulate, to not insinuate that it is the Americas. I appreciate raising that.
No, definitely. That's a great point. And what I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from PragerU, which is a right-wing think tank, Zionist, America-loving think tank by this guy named Dennis Prager. And this video is called "What is Wrong with the 1619 Project?" So for those of you who are unaware, the 1619 Project, granted, right, the New York Times, fuck the New York Times, they're whack as fuck. They're not a friend of socialist or communist movement. But the 1619 Project was analyzing the year 1619, the history of settler colonialism and slavery in the U.S., which in and of itself is important to study, right, regardless of who's putting out that information. So I want to be clear, because the second you say that, they're like, "Oh, look at you, you're a New York Times liberal." It's like, no, like, it's important to, we can study that as communists without necessarily saying we support the New York Times. But anyway, there was a lot of interesting information in that that talked about cross-class alliances between white settlers in the United States. We'll talk about that. I think the best historian on this, hands down, is Dr. Gerald Horne, somebody who I have mad respect for, and somebody who has been getting a lot of hate, even from leftists, even from white leftists who are like, "Oh, he's dividing the working class." So it's like, no, like, he is pointing out, not only is he like a dope revolutionary communist, but he has great historical in-depth analysis, primary resources about the cross-class alliances between settlers. And so, the 1619 Project is kind of talking about that as well. So I want to play this clip of this guy from PragerU who's trying to debunk it, and then we can respond to it.
Have you heard of the 1619 Project? It was published by the New York Times in August of 2019. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2020. Its thesis: the United States was founded in 1619 when the first slave was brought to North America. Wait, that brings up some questions. What happened to 1776? To July 4th? The Declaration of Independence? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison? According to the 1619 Project, the Founding Fathers pushed for all that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness stuff to protect their slave holdings. Independence from England? That was just a smokescreen. To them, everything that's wrong with America is tied to her original sin of slavery, from segregation to traffic jams. Yes, traffic jams. For the 1619 Project authors, racism is not a part of the American experience. It is the American experience. Is this true? Let's look at three of the project's major claims. 1. Preserving slavery was the real cause of the American Revolution. If you asked the founders why they no longer wanted to be a British colony, they would have given you a long list of reasons. Taxation without representation, conflicts over debts from the French and Indian War, and the Stamp Act would be just a few. Probably most important was the burning desire to be free, to chart their own destiny as a sovereign nation. Protecting slavery was not under threat from the British. In fact, Britain didn't free the slaves in its overseas colonies until 1833, 57 years later, after the Declaration of Independence. Yes, the subject of slavery was hotly debated at the Constitutional Convention, but that was after the war was won. 2. Slavery made America rich. Slavery made some Americans rich, true enough. Eli Yale, for example, made a fortune in the slave trade. He donated money and land for the university that is named after him. But the institution of slavery didn't make America rich. In fact, the slave system badly slowed the economic development of half the country.
Wow. So, Comrade Erica, your reaction to this guy?
No, I just had to, as he was speaking, well, two things. He sounds like a robot, and I see that someone in the comments pointed that out too, and I just thought that was weird because he looks like one, like how he was staring at the camera, and he also sounded like one. So, typical PragerU stuff. But also, I had to go grab my horn book because I don't know if you can see it, but this really debunks everything. And funny enough, Gerald Horne has his own criticisms of the 1619 Project, right? Primarily because those are journalists and not historians. And I do appreciate that Dr. Sharice Bernstein, she always says that Gerald Horne, who is the people's historian, will forget more than we will ever learn. So, he really, this is a 3-part series, this book. And I really recommend that everyone gets it, but it really breaks down the fundamental reasons behind the American Revolution, starting with the alleged, what is it? The taxation without, how that even formed, right? Because they were having their own issues with the British, who were already starting that abolition movement in the Caribbean because they were getting their asses beat fundamentally, and then ultimately, because the slaves were revolted. So they were trying to pull out. So yeah. I'm not too much in. People have a lot of criticisms about the 1619, but what I think is more important is even what we see with critical race theory is that we allow the right to dictate how we even engage, right? Because now we can't even have actual criticisms about the 1619 Project, right? Because now we have to protect it, whether or not it has some flaws in it, and it does. But the right dictates how we even engage our own works. The right is now dictating how we're having these conversations about our own histories, about our own truths. So that, but ultimately what that person said, I don't even know if they were a for real journalist, honestly. It was a little
for real.
But it wasn't so much of bullshit. But that's also how we're taught. That's exactly how we're taught what sparked the American Revolution. From grade school on, upward, they don't sway or move away from that particular narrative. So anything that disrupts that, especially when we're, in a progressive post-racism era, right? Post-Obama, post-racism era, anything that's disrupting that's saying that the foundational fabric of America is slavery, which we can also want to include and should include, indigenous erasure as well, or the attempts for indigenous erasure, right? Because they're still here. But the attempts for indigenous erasure and the subjugation of, colonized nationalities are what historically did build America. But that doesn't, if we're trying to push this post-racism narrative, even from the right, because they're accepting of colonized nationalities as well, then we have, because there's a bunch of us within the right that dismiss all of that too. That's not real history. We got to get over slavery. you know? So anything that disrupts that, they form a narrative and then we respond.
Yeah. No, and it definitely, and for me, it's kind of like gaslighting, right? For me, it's
Yeah.
kind of like if you've been in a abusive relationship or something, somebody's been, fucking you up for years, or talking down at you, or treating you badly. And then out of nowhere, they're just like, you know what? Let's start from scratch. We're just equals now. Let's forget about the past. The past is behind us. We can't let the past rule us. Well, it's like, yo, you've been fucking me over for like the past 400 years. How do you expect me to just magically
Right.
agree and embrace this identity that you have used to colonize my people?
Right. Right.
And shout out, by the way, to Comrade Only. I'm a little late, but I'm here. Greens all. Please make sure to subscribe to AAPRP New Mexico. Comrade Only has amazing content. Me and Erica were on this webinar on Thursday about the connection. But yeah, it was really dope, and I feel like it was a cool group of people talking about the interconnectedness between anti-communism and imperialism. So please make sure to check out Comrade Oni's channel, where we have that webinar. Comrade Volvo said, slavery slowed down economic development is a moot argument when you can still extract enormous profits from it, which is what capitalists care about. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, people make it seem like, they're like, oh, slavery hurts all workers. I'm like, not really.
Right, right. And the moment that it did is when it was abolished, right?
Right.
Slavery by Eric Williams. We know that the moment that it really did start to affect the bourgeois of the, because they still never cared about the I guess the lower class whites who did in fact still in one way or the other participate in a slave form of capital and trade. The moment it started to affect them, then it was abolished. Then, then it was easier to sit down and talk about the process to eliminating slavery. But as long as they were all for it. Right.
Yeah, and even like connecting that too with the genocide of indigenous peoples. Like, imagine for somebody who is Lenape or somebody from the indigenous communities of the East Coast to see the 13 stripes on the flag, right? To see, understanding that those red stripes of blood are based on their land, are based on their nation being wiped out systematically by the United States, by people like Andrew Jackson, by the Trail of Tears, the expansionism, and Manifest Destiny. Those stars, right? Those 50 stars that include the states of Arizona and New Mexico, where there's already still to this day indigenous peoples, a Navajo Nation, Apache Nation resisting empire, and how disgusting it is to see that your land, your nation is just a little star. Like, it's like when I see these asshole veterans, like the other day was Veterans Day, and I saw some dude with like he had like the Vietnam shit. I was like, dude, take that shit. Like, I felt like just smacking that hat off of his head. Like, he was wearing it like a prize. I'm like, you know what you guys did in Vietnam, like just under the U.S. flag.
Right. Yeah, I feel like they do and they don't. Like, it's such a cognitive dissonance, especially when we look at like colonized nationalist people, racialized people who are within the military. And I get the poverty draft narrative, because that is true, but then also there is real truth to the fact that people are really tied to the identity of America or being American, and for them they really do. I mean, people who are just haphazardly or just mindlessly saying thank you for your service without even thinking about what services are we thanking them for? Like, what does the military do? But so we're like conditioned into these ideas and ideals where a day that initially started off as a day of remembrance, right? So that we remember to never engage in war again because it's so awful, has now become a day where we're like mindlessly thanking people for their service in which they are engaging in war. Like it's just some abstract thing. So
it's like Thank you for killing thousands of rice farmers in Vietnam. We really appreciate that. You know, it's just it's really disgusting.
For our freedoms, no less, right? While we're still
Right.
fighting to try to vote, for voting rights, and we're still getting our asses beat and shot in the street. We have no place to live, and but they're over
The
there
worst part of
freedoms.
right, and the worst part about it too is like, even like, you know, I grew up in New York, and even out here in LA, the hardest hit veterans are Black veterans from the Vietnam War, who many of whom are homeless, who have a lot of mental health issues, PTSD, who a lot of them were forcibly drugged in Vietnam. There's all these reports talking about these rogue commanders in Vietnam who were drugging Black US military personnel and trying to trick them into killing, you know, the Viet Cong. And it's just really disgusting to see that even within the US Army, like they subjugate people of color and put them as the cannon fodder for this empire that does not give a fuck about them, you know?
Right. Yeah. And when I speak to veterans who are now in the movement, you know, they talk about those type of experiences and how they do all that they can so that their children are not left with those options, like either join the military or do nothing, you know?
Do you have crazy glue?
No, I don't.
And Comrade only said, oh man, I just got blocked this morning from some active duty US military person who argued that land reform in Vietnam was genocide. And I was like, so what were all the US military massacres? And he blocked me. Oh my God. Yeah, it's something that is I get into those debates all the time, but at this point I'm just like, man, I'm kind of done with that. What I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is another clip from PragerU, Why I Love America by Dennis Prager. And he's going to talk about what makes the US quote unquote different from other countries. And we'll get your reaction, Comrade Erica.
America became the freest country in world history, which is why France gave the Statue of Liberty to one country, America. And America has given more liberty and opportunity to more people from more nations than any country in world history. Yes, America allowed slavery in half of its states, but every society in the world practiced slavery. What rendered America unique is that Americans killed one another in its bloodiest war to abolish slavery, and that it eventually became the least racist, multiracial country in history. It remains the only white majority country to have ever elected a Black leader. And Africans know how good America is, which is why by the 1980s, more Black Africans had come to America voluntarily as immigrants seeking freedom and opportunity than ever came as slaves. 3. Americans are decent people. Ask visitors what they think of Americans. They're likely to tell you how friendly Americans are. There are mean and bad Americans, and there are kind and good people in every country. But having traveled abroad every year of my life since college, and to all 50 American states, and being sensitive to people's goodness and happiness, I have been continually amazed at the essential decency of most Americans. I fell in love with America at the age of 20, and given the freedom, the opportunities, and the religious tolerance I have experienced, I realize all these years later that America has loved me too.
So, Comrade Volvo had a funny comment there, like, so you're just going to torture us with PragerU. The thing is, here's the thing, it's not even just PragerU. And the reason why it's important to point that out is that even within the left, there's this growing narrative and apologetics for America and the United States, and saying, okay, that's just a minor part of the history. This is the common theme, right? They're like, yes, we had slavery. Yes, we've colonized the whole world. Yes, we've committed genocide against indigenous peoples. Yes, we've done all these horrible things. But that's just a fraction, a minority of our history, of our people. The overwhelming majority is good and progressive. And that's sort of what Dennis Prager was talking about in this video. So, Comrade Erica, your reaction to all that?
I don't know if you ever seen that meme, but where he's like, yes, there was some slavery. Like, that was the thing I thought of, because it's just like, how do you just, okay, but that's the foundation, right? And if the Constitution hasn't been rewritten since the days where there was slavery, to act like these things are like they have no connection or they're somehow distant, but it's I don't know. PragerU is a wild place. I don't really even know how to respond. Yeah, yes. Look.
Now, yes, there was some slavery, but
okay, so yes, there was some slavery, right? And then to even the way that they used Obama, the way that they're using Africa, without any context, right? Like, it's just like, oh yeah, African immigrants just come here, right? Because they know how good it is. It's like, well, why are they coming here? Let's talk about Africa.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the neocolonialism that's happening on the continent, that the U.S. has their hands in, that they're stirring up with all these NGOs. Let's talk about what's happening in the Congo and all these sanctions that's happening in the Horn. Like, look at Somalia. Like, people are not just haphazardly, voluntarily. You're making it hard for people to live in their countries, but that's not, because I guess that's the same when you're saying that it's not just PragerU. It's like it's a growing sort of conversation happening within like the white sectors of the left, or whatever goes for the left.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But
right.
I feel like that conversation in itself. Trying to find the wording that I was just thinking of. Like, when you say that it's a growing conversation, I'm thinking about the ways that they push back at large about any of it, right? They're not wanting to have any, just even the whole, it's class, not race. The way that they talk about nationalism, the way that they don't engage geopolitics or anti-imperialism in a meaningful way, right? They always seem to have some sort of reactionary line that's pro-U.S. when it comes to what's happening in these other nations, and these other nations that are attempting to build a socialism that they say that they want, that they themselves have never seen on the land that they are occupying, but are criticizing heavily. And I think that that's in the same disconnect, the same way that they approach, that same hidden context of what the empire is actually doing. I don't see that being any different from what we just witnessed with PragerU. So I do like that you sort of said that, because I'm like, yeah, that is kind of the same way they just refuse to actually engage anti-imperialism.
Well, I've heard a lot of white leftists, they'll say like, that divides the left. And I've had this debate too, because I'm a supporter of Marcus Garvey. I think Marcus Garvey is somebody who, not perfect, right? But somebody who overall I think was doing amazing things, organizing African peoples, the African diaspora, and was somebody who had revolutionary nationalist views. And when I bring that up within the white left, they're like, like, how dare you? Marcus Garvey was, don't you know, he was a racist. He was divisive. He was a black capitalism and all this stuff.
He was a colonizer. Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, but then at that point, it's like, you don't understand that the white settler imperialist country of the United States has grown by subverting other countries' abilities to even develop. And as a communist, as a Marxist-Leninist, you have to understand that, yes, class is the primary determinant factor, and that, yes, there is such a thing as, people only, that there is such a thing as the importance of national liberation and sovereignty. And this is something that Lenin and Stalin talked about, the right of nations to self-determination, that even though certain nationalist movements may not necessarily outwardly be socialist or communist, it's still important to defend those movements because they are resisting the empire of imperialism led by the white settlers. And Marcus Garvey was somebody who was doing that, and he is demonized in the white Western left for being racist and just being nationalist. And it just goes to, and they say, oh, don't divide the workers with all this race stuff, right? You're being ultra left. You're being, you're believing the propaganda. And in a way, like to a degree, right there, like I think the liberal imperialists have capitalized on that and only focus on race instead of class. And that is true. And we'll admit that. But it's like to use that to completely make it seem like white and black and indigenous peoples are on the same equal playing field level of oppression is complete nonsense. Yeah. Look at the raw statistics. Look at poverty in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Georgia, in Florida, where black people live conditions that are third world conditions. Look at Navajo Nation, Apache Nation, where people live like it's in the global South. And then compare that to the majority of quote unquote white workers in the United States that make 2 or 3 times the average poverty line. The statistics prove it and show it, So I think it's something that it's just complete insensitivity to those differences.
Yeah. And to your point about Marcus Garvey, I mean, yeah, sure, there's certainly criticisms, and in his day, he had he caught a lot of them. People had a lot to say about Garvey, but I think the movement of the UNIA and the mass amount of Africans, that the way that people were organized, and then he influenced several people who've gone on to be socialists and gone on to be communists, who started as Garveyites, and that's across regions. That was in the Caribbean, that was in South America, that was in the US, that was on the continent, and who's doing that? And I feel like certainly we can criticize, but that's the point, right? We should be able to go back and study what worked and what didn't work. And when we look at the way that he was able to organize masses of people, should be our focus. Because all the other things we understand different. It's a different perspective. We're talking about things that, there was the First World War didn't even happen as Garveyism was built, was being built and happening, which I'm thinking about a lot lately, because I've been hearing more people talk about this, about how that we could argue that was really the real break for socialism actually being able to happen, because we had workers fighting workers on behalf of the bourgeoisie in the First World War, right? But at this time where Garveyism was being built, when Leninism was being built, so I think, and so the criticism for Garvey, which there are many, and some hold true validity, really don't stand the test of time, I'd say, as far as when we're looking at where we're at now. And then it's also funny when I think the race class thing is also how they look at the global South, or how they look at the third world. Like, oh, we're all equal workers. Like, no, we're not. We live within an empire, right? So even as our consumption habits, even as poor people, is encouraged, because America, that's the American way, that's the US way, consumption. It's a capitalist nation that runs on that. It's running through corporations. We are propagandized to consume. So even when we have nothing, we still find a way to consume something, and that still comes off the back of so even to have those conversations or attempt to have those conversations, people are automatically like, no, that's not how it is. And it's just like, that's exactly how it is. Especially when we look at this is an imperialist nation that's spreading its hegemony, or attempting to, right? That does not come without consequences to the people who actually live there.
Exactly. Definitely. And that's connected to something that Comrade Volvo was saying. First of all, we should stop putting the left in the imperial core, especially the white left, in the same level as the ones in the global South. Right. They have nothing in common in material conditions. That's exactly right. I mean, and here's the thing, right? So immediately, the immediate response to that will say, well, you're a worker in the working class if you earn a wage, and if you don't own the means of production, you're automatically part of the working class. Yes, technically, yes. And Marx talks about this in Capital, right? Technically, yes. If you don't own the means of production, if you only can earn a wage to sustain yourself, then yes, you technically are a worker, and that would include an $80,000 or $90,000 a year white construction worker in the U.S. However,
Bernie,
the part that they always fail to mention is that in the same book, in Capital, Marx talks about the rate of exploitation. There is an actual formula that can explain how a worker in Haiti, in the Congo, in Indonesia, in Mexico is objectively more exploited because more surplus labor is extracted from the product of their material, right? For example, look at the way that Fruit of the Loom and Hanes and Gildan have moved production from Canada to the US, where they have to pay North American workers higher wages, than moving operations to Haiti, which they have in the past few years, where they make, right, exactly. And so they make more surplus value. They make more profit from the exploitation of Haitian workers, of Honduran workers, of Mexican workers, because they're able to pay lower wages. So even though, yes, technically the sweatshop worker in Haiti making a t-shirt is also a worker, just like a $90,000 a year construction worker in the US. Technically, yes, but you're missing the big picture, which Marx talks about in Capital, and we can't ignore that, which is the rate of exploitation, which is the relationship between the necessary value and the surplus value. He talks about it, and that's completely ignored. And on that basis, people are like, oh, well, we're just as equally oppressed. We're just as equally. So then that means that all this racism stuff, that's a distraction. You're distracting from the working, and so it's just interesting. These are some of the debates that I've been seeing resurface on the left that I think are really important to go over from a revolutionary global South nationalist perspective,
And it perpetuates colonialism here, right? Because we understand it as a project. So ultimately, it's legitimizing it further, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we refuse to even attempt to make those connections or understand those relationships that we have to labor in the third world, which, like when you mention Mississippi and Alabama, is not that distinguishable from the way that the workers, Black workers are in those areas. Living conditions. So I feel like once we really start to make those connections, we can really start chipping away at the settler colonial project. But
exactly.
That we're all on one footing because the workers of the world unite. I think that we're missing that in order to unite, we really have to really understand the differences here.
Of course, exactly. And that doesn't mean just because there's differences, we can't work together, and we should work together. But it's just having the respect to be like, yo, for me, for example, right? I'm a cis straight Latino man. I'm never going to know what it feels to be a trans or LGBTQ disabled person who's also working class. So it's even though, yes, we're both working class, I'm not going to put myself on an equal footing as somebody who has had a more systemic oppression, because in and of itself, by doing that, it's sort of like when they call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where it's oh, both sides, no, one side is the aggressor, one side is
Oddly enough, people understand intersectionality on that level, but don't understand it on a more global aspect, or even understand it through capitalism, right? I think that, well, I have my own issues with intersectionality and its usage, but but I feel like people understand, or they're able to use it to understand the differences, right? But when we talk about international issues, then it becomes obsolete.
Of course, definitely. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip from our favorite person, Thomas Sowell, who's somebody who is touted by Candace Owens and others, Kanye. And this is a clip from this thing called The Truth About Colonization, Never Taught in School. So I want to play this clip. Thomas Sowell, somebody who loves, quote unquote, America, who loves capitalism. And we're going to play this and get your reaction.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the Third World, for example, those parts of the Third World where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the Third World that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development, because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. You know, 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome, but that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying that this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland, and then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think politically it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some independent nations, they say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today. Do you see that, the operation of the multinational corporation, as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before. To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
RSJ had a funny comment, and the person who's interviewing him kind of helps him out rather than challenge him. I feel like that older white dude who's interviewing him is like, you see, guys, why can't you all be like him? Why can't you all think colonialism was a good thing, right? your reaction, Erica.
Right. Well, how is that much different than what Obama said when he went back to Africa, right? Yeah, I think he makes as much sense as Candace Owens, truthfully. It's just a lot of babble. And interestingly enough, he does that thing I think we spoke about when we spoke about Candace Owens. Like, you're able to, and Big T noted it too. Like, oh, you can go all the way back to make your point, right? This obsession with Rome and the Ottoman Empire and things like that to make your point without ever actually having to deal with the material reality of today, colonialism today, and neocolonialism of today, right? To make these abstract, examples of how good it was for Britain that ultimately became what we know of Britain now, right? With leaving out the colonization of Africa, leaving out the slave trade entirely. It was because Britain was colonized, Britain was able to become Britain without ever, addressing India, the other parts of Asia. So I just think that he said a lot of nothing, ultimately. Yeah. But I do think that for people who need to dismiss these ideas that there are oppressive systems that are responsible for our material realities or our existence or what we're experiencing, that exists on many levels. I was listening. What was it? I Mixed What I Like yesterday morning. They had played a clip, and it was this. I guess he's a battle rapper. I don't listen to battle raps.
Mm-hmm.
awful. But but he was basically like saying, oh, the problem is where the parents, right, making those conservative talking points. So we understand like these talking points where they're not looking to actually punch up and address oppressive systems exist on multiple levels. So Thomas, he will grab people like that. He certainly grabs Candace Owens, right, who needs his existence and his work to exist so that she can ultimately, I think, copy it, but but have a platform to continue it. But no, it's ahistorical.
Yeah. No, it's the whole personal responsibility, pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. By the way, for those of you who are listening, this is an important map that I think the many white Western leftists have to study and have respect for. This is Indian land cessions. Even the titling is kind of like fucked up because it's making it seem like they just gave it up woefully. But this is a map of indigenous lands that were stolen over time. We can see, for example, 1784 to 1819, the majority was unceded, was indigenous lands, right? You had the quote unquote 13 colonies, these brutal, and this is again 1784. That's already surpassed. That's already passing all the other colonization and slavery that had already taken place. 1820 to 1839 kept on expanding all the way up until Texas, what is today Texas, Illinois. 1840 to 1859, even more, right? And then 1860 to 1879, the quote unquote Reconstruction and after the Civil War, right? And people say, oh, this is against slavery and colonization. Yet even after that, they're still expanding into indigenous lands, right? In what is Arizona, Nebraska, New Mexico, 1880 to 1972, almost all of it is colonized and conquered and settled on and branded under this empire called the United States. So you have to, like, with that in mind, right? Like, people, I think the white left needs to study that, because when they're talking about trying to like use the U.S. flag and trying to tell Afro-Indigenous peoples to just shut up and embrace American patriotism, it's like, dude, like your idea, your empire is based on the settlement of our peoples and our lands. So you're going to understand how we're not going to be openly receptive to that. And by the way, that's just on the contiguous U.S. map. That's just on the contiguous U.S. Borders,
Yeah. I don't know. I never really delved too deep into that patriotism debate because I mean, on its face, it's silly, right? Because what are we asking people to do? like how do we even? Because like how are we understanding the United States? How are we understanding the settler colonialism as a project? If this is even a conversation, that means there's like we have to go back to the drawing board. We have to go back to scratch and like break down these concepts and these ideas and these actual like ideologies, because it doesn't. Is like for me? Well, I just want to know: is the idea of a patriotism or a socialist patriotism? Is it just like establishing socialism here within America? Is that like the ultimate goal? Like that socialism could be established here?
Well, here's the thing, right? So the debate has been framed really incorrectly, right? Because, for example, I consider myself a socialist, patriot or nationalist, but of global South colonized peoples, right? I support Haitian nationalism. I support Haitian patriotism. I support Cuban patriotism, Angolan, right? Because the nationalism of oppressed nations in the global South has a totally different class and historical character than, say, British or quote unquote American or Australian or even Israeli, right? Like, imagine somebody calling themselves, I'm an Israeli patriot. I'm an Israeli proletarian patriot. I'm like, no, Israel is on stolen Palestinian land, and it has a totally different class character. So it's like, so it's been framed, the debate has been framed like, are you a socialist patriot or not? Whereas like, no, I'm a socialist patriot, but for whom, right? Whom am I a socialist patriot for? I'm a socialist patriot for Zimbabwe, for African peoples and indigenous peoples in the belly of the beast, for global South peoples, but not for somebody who's a white dude in Nebraska who's waving a U.S. settler imperialist flag that's embracing an identity. For me, I see that as the same way as an Israeli settler waving an Israeli flag on stolen Palestinian land. And for me, it's just been mind-boggling that people will say they're pro-Palestine and they're anti-Zionist, but then they support the nationalism and patriotism of another settler colonial state like the U.S.
Right. Well, that's what I was saying. We got to get back to basics, right? Understanding, like, I guess not the duality of nationalism, but that there are like different types of nationalism. I think that's why people are like automatically on its face against Black nationalism, because there's, you know, reactionary Black nationalism, there's revolutionary Black nationalism. So people are more used to seeing, I guess, the reactionary versions of Black nationalism and not understanding it through actual national projects. Yeah. So, but I always, I mean, it sounds as silly as I thought it was, which is why,
Yeah,
which is probably
yeah,
why I really engaged it, or paid too much attention. Right. Yeah. Well,
yeah, and
exactly.
Comrade Only had a great comment. She said a lot of times what those socialist patriots do is attempt to flatten the contradictions of the U.S. empire by saying, oh, there are settler states all over the Western Hemisphere. And that's exactly right. I think that's such a great point, because then they'll say, look, Cuba was a settler country. Why can they wave the Cuban flag? Or Brazil, you know, was a settler country. Why can they, if they can wave it, I can wave it. But you're missing 200, 300 years of history. It doesn't stop in the 1800s. What happened in the go back to your history books. What happened in the 1800s and the 1900s? The United States became the preeminent imperialist world power. The U.S. expanded not only into indigenous and African lands in the contiguous U.S., it colonized the entire world, right? That's a totally different historical trajectory than Cuba, which remained a neo-colony of the U.S., of Spain, of other countries. So to act like, okay, well, Cuba did it, right? So Cuba had some settlers, so we can wave our flag. Brazil, it's like, no, you're missing a completely different historical trajectory. So I'm glad that Comrade Only pointed that out.
Yeah, that's true. But I think, again, your point, like, even when we say go back to the history books, right? We have to actually, like, direct them to the right ones, because it is the history books that's fucking them up. I think it's an education thing, ultimately, like even the battle for CRT, right?
Yeah.
It's a ridiculous battle that would, if you ask me, the MSNBC and the Democrats completely created that whole mess on their own, like, because I think they tried to play it like they played the Trump thing. If we continue to make this the issue, and again, it backfired, and now there's CRT debates where all over the place where there should be none. But I think, like, the way we are taught in school, like, even when I was watching the map that you put up of I'm thinking of having played Oregon Trails in middle school. Like, it was like that normalized, like, frontiers, being frontiers and being settlers is that sort of normalized thing. And we're indoctrinated into that shit. Like, I was dead thinking about Oregon Trails, and to be honest, it was fun. We had it was a fun game to play as a child. But if you think about what the fuck we were playing,
right?
Oh yeah, and what we, and that sort of conditioning into this sort of idea of America, and we don't even question colonialism. Even when I have to be mindful of, like, not the erasure of indigenous people, but the attempts to erase indigenous people, right? Because they're still here, and they're still fighting for their land. But I think that we don't, they're the way that they're discussed is as if there are no longer any indigenous people, in Turtle Island, or the tribes exist. And then until we hear about what happened with the schools, or like those sort of circumstances, or the pipeline circumstance, when it's those immediate circumstances that draws attention, then it's like, oh, there's a large sector, and then people start to get more, I don't want to say involved, but they do certainly become more aware. But for the most part, because look how many laws are this fly-by-night, under-the-radar laws that subjugate them even further, that take even more land, that break even more treaties, that just go unspoken about, especially on a on the left, I would say, because we don't, obviously mainstream media is not going to speak about these things, but on the left in general, it's not spoken about in the same ways that we try to uplift other, marginalized groups and their issues, and just make those connections. Because I think that if we start to see what's happening with them, we better understand settler colonialism as an ongoing project.
Exactly.
Not just right? And then
it's still happening.
Yeah, indigenous people everywhere, not just people who are indigenous to just this land, but people, indigenous communities and indigenous people everywhere that I think we don't even consider or understand, right? Because I think what's happening now too with the term indigenous, now we're just starting to just block it off to just the United States and Turtle Island, like understand indigenous, which is why we communicate settler colonialism. Like we understand colonialism elsewhere, but only understand indigenous peoples here. So it's like it's weird. Several discussions and discourses happening that don't connect because people are not understanding just the basics of language and these terminologies that they're so hell bent on using consistently, and just to have discourse.
Yeah, it's like in Zimbabwe, where like the Africans of Zimbabwe are the Black Africans of Zimbabwe are indigenous to the land, and then you had these white settlers who named it Rhodesia. Imagine if they came out and were like, "Oh, we're Rhodesian patriotic socialists," with our, it's like no, like Rhodesia as an idea, as a concept, was based on Cecil Rhodes and an imperialist and who settled that area and wiped out indigenous Zimbabwean peoples of that area. So I totally agree, Comrade Eric. That's something that is so important to really go over. And with that in mind, it's been really dope speaking to you. And shout out to everybody who's watching and listening to this, by the way. And and feel free to comment, let us know what you think. I think it's important to have these discussions. Even though I am somebody who I do not identify as American. I reject the idea of American. I'm a patriotic socialist, but I'm not an American patriotic socialist, if that makes sense. At the same time, I recognize the importance of dialogue and having conversations and studying, because that's really the approach we have to have. We have to continuously study and have the humility to be like, okay, I see it this way. Let's see what the other people think, and have that debate and study those ideas. But Erica, why don't you tell us a little bit about, maybe you can tell us about liberation through reading and how that can serve as an antidote to the backlash against Black and Brown history in schools, because there is a suppression of the teaching of Black and Brown history in schools, especially in right-wing states. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about liberation through reading.
Yeah. So I started Liberation Through Reading. There's two components of it. There's the book gifting program, and then there's the book club. So the book gifting program is for young adults and kids from ages, like, we have picture books and up, right? So I think maybe freshman year of college, I want to say, because we still have some Morrison, we have some, we have Du Bois and others. So I do always like to say maybe college level reading. But the intention behind it, which I'm trying to I'm in the process of thinking about reworking it, because the intention behind it was obviously the lack of these sort of representation that we see our children receiving or not receiving in these schools. Ultimately, a lot of us don't have the option except to put our children in public schools. So when I started it, it was during a back to school program that was happening. I was asked if I can contribute. I had nothing really to contribute. And then I thought of the idea of asking when I was on Twitter, my little Twitter community, if they could donate some books for this back to school. And I got over 200 books. I created a wish list, and the wish, it's intentional too. The books that I picked, there's a lot of authors from the Black arts movement, like Nikki Giovanni and Gwendolyn Brooks. James Baldwin has children. These are people that you would never know. Like James Baldwin has a children's book, Bell Hooks has children's books. And they're all, I try to stray away so much of because there are a lot. I never want to be confused. There are a lot of books to represent Black children, African children. There are. But are there a lot of meaningful books
Yep.
That's where the lane gets slimmer. I try to incorporate that. So I have some I could probably show on the side.
Yeah, most definitely. Liberation through reading is something that's really important. I think for me, I highly recommend people check out Dr. Gerald Horne, somebody who I have mad respect for, a people's historian who has amazing history about the settler colonialism in the United States. Comrade only said, "Liberation through reading is a dope and necessary program. Children and families are part of the revolution." Indeed, they are the cells of the revolution.
So it's a gifting. It's like a give back program, right? Because I'm not sponsored by anybody except community when I make the calls. So I like to say that's a give it forward program. I put a list out, whatever book that you like. If you want to buy it for a kid, please do. So some of the books that we have are like James Baldwin, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. We have children's books on Haiti and the Haitian Revolution.
Oh, that's so sick.
Yeah, children's books on Harriet Tubman.
Nice.
And then, like I mentioned, this is James Baldwin's children's book. We also have books on Paul Robeson and the Spanish War when he went over there. So those are the type of books that we gift out, and I've been lucky and very appreciative enough to have gifted over 2,000 since 2017 when we started, and in multiple cities. So we've been to Philadelphia, we've been to New York. Obviously, I do it in Baltimore and then my surrounding county in Maryland where I am. We've done it here. So I'm looking to expand, but I'm also a little apprehensive about the way that representation is used now, because I've always been very intentional, right? Like I've had conversations about Black Panther and the movie and how amped up people were about representation. And it was just like, okay, so you left the theater. Are there Black people in your home? Like, are there books in your home? Are there Black artwork? Do you talk about Blackness with your children? Like, what kind of conversations are you having once you leave that theater, once you leave that Marvel experience? So that's what really sparked this idea. And then the book club exists where I provide the books on PDF forms. We read this Horn book that we read Walter Rodney, we've read Robert D.G. Kelly, we've read Frantz Fanon, we've read George Jackson, we've engaged Audre Lorde, So the intention is for adults who just don't read, they want to, they just don't have the time, they struggle reading individually, and engaging these works from a more Black left politic. Because at the time, I was like, when I started the book club, there wasn't too many people that were like, yeah, I'm a Black communist. That's right. Like, it wasn't happening on Twitter like that. Like,
For real. You're like one of the OGs. Yeah.
It was not happening like that, but people were interested in it. So I wanted to offer that space because at that time I always found myself saying, we exist. So I offered that space, and then shout out to Dr. Charity Clay. She started Say Word Book Club on Twitter. So it initially started as a hashtag book club on Twitter, and then I got booted the fuck off. So now we're on GroupMe, and we've been on GroupMe ever since, and we've engaged, I think, over like 20 books, and it's been super dope, and it's been lovely conversations. And the most recent that we read, I try to keep it based on things that we're seeing now. So the last book that we read was Race in Cuba by Gerald Horne, and then we got to speak with Gerald Horne. He came through and spoke with a few of the people in the book club. So
that's awesome, man. That's Race to Revolution, Dr. Gerald Horne, really great. And I suggest though many the white left study and actually have respect for there are Black and Indigenous communists, and please read and study their work and get a sense of how they feel about America, or identifying with this empire. And I think it's important. You'll learn a lot, right? Because it's important. We have to study Marx and Lenin and all that, but we also have to study Kwame Ture. We have to study Amilcar Cabral, Patrice Lumumba. It's Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru. right? There's so many, we have to have that respect to study that and to understand the national question and why national liberation is part of the Marxist-Leninist movement. If you're a genuine Marxist-Leninist, you support indigenous liberation, you support reparations, right? You support reparations for all African colonized oppressed peoples. It's not ultra left. It's not dividing the working class. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And please support liberation through reading. Maybe Erica, at some point you could send me the link or something to how people can help out, because I think. Mm-hmm.
And then I also want to say, to your point about reparations, one of the books that we did read, because, you know, at the time, ADOS was coming up more frequently, conversations around them. And there's a book called Marxism, Black Liberation, and Reparations. And I think Workers' World Party is a collection of articles for the Workers' World Party. So there's some pieces from OMIA and things like that where you really get to understand both the national question and also reparations as a larger global question and not just right here, and how Marxism is evoked in that, or could be.
Yeah, this is it right here. I actually read that book. It's
that is a really good book that we got to engage.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I suggest people check that out and take the time to study it. Comrade Erica, it's been really dope speaking to you, dropping truth and knowledge as always. An amazing time. Erica is a poet, writer, and organizer in Baltimore in the DMV area. She's an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, the Black Alliance for Peace. I'm also a member of Black Alliance for Peace. Please support BAP, sign up, become a member, and also an outreach member of the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with the books that represent them. Also, shout out to Hood Communist. Please support Hood Communist. Big shout out to Hood Communist. Amazing work. We're gonna go out to one of my favorite artists, who is Dennis Brown. This song is called Revolution. Thank you so much, Erica. Peace out, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Do you know what it means to have a revolution? And what it takes to make a solution? Fighting against oppression, boy, not turning down depression, boy, 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 are you ready to stand up and fight the rights revolution? Are you ready to stand up and fight it just like soldiers? Many are called, you are chosen. Look here. Many are called, you are chosen. Boy, whoa, boy.